Let's begin with prayer. Oh God, you who carried Israel from Egypt on eagle's wings, as we study your word and the story of salvation of our forebears in faith, remind us of the meaning of true freedom, to serve you and not to serve Pharaoh. In the name of Christ we pray.
Amen. Amen.
Okay, today we are doing the first of 2 days on the book of Exodus. And I want to start by just saying a little bit about what I think are the main barriers to understanding and then to teaching and preaching on Exodus. The main barrier I think you're going to encounter is not the Hebrew text of Exodus. It's not the historical distance from which we stand from this story and the dearth of historical information we have surrounding the events narrated in the book. The greatest barrier you're going to have is Cecil B. DeMille. And it's incredible how influential the film The Ten Commandments has been. And I can remember, again, back in the dark ages when we had 3 television networks, and at least once a year, the Ten Commandments was shown on one of those networks around one of the religious holidays, and everybody watched it. It's still the case, even though we've got hundreds of channels. Some of these will continue to show the Ten Commandments around certain religious holidays, Easter, Passover. And for many people, that has become sort of like the definitive exegesis of the book of Exodus. It's a great piece of cinema, but in many ways, it has very little to do with the book of Exodus. And you can read Exodus closely and then watch the film and just note all the things that they do. I'll mention a couple of them today. There was actually a biblical scholar who was a consultant for that film, David Noel Friedman, who was briefly on our faculty ages ago, but quite famous biblical scholar who died a number of years ago. Has edited, I think, more volumes than anybody else. He was the editor of the Anchor Bible Dictionary, for example, the Anchor Bible Commentary Series. Apparently, they asked his teacher, W.F. Albright, who's the best-known archaeologist of the day, if he would be a consultant, and he had no interest in doing that, so he must have said, well, I've got this student, Friedman, he might want to do it, and either he did it because his teacher pointed him to it, or they paid him, or maybe he just wanted to hang around a movie set. I don't know exactly what he did, but I don't think they listened to him a whole lot. Maybe he helped with, costumes or something. I don't know. Let me just name 2 things that I think Cecil B. DeMille has done in the film that, if you all are familiar with it, as most people are, you can recognize these, that I think creates some difficulty for us in interpreting the book. First of all, Cecil B. DeMille begins the film with his own voice, narrating. And the first word, at least that I can remember hearing him say, is freedom. And as he talks about freedom, you see these images of these enslaved peoples, carrying heavy burdens and trudging along and so on. And he's going on about freedom and how humans have always longed for freedom and everything. Now, that is a theme of the book, no doubt about it, but he talks about it in ways that suggest a freedom that we might, as Americans, kind of recognize, the idea that no one tells you what to do. You, within the limits of the law, or and so on, we understand these things have limits, but you can go where you want to go, do what you want to do. That's the idea. That's not the freedom that the book of Exodus presents. It is really a choice between serving Pharaoh and serving the Lord. Interesting that when Moses says to Pharaoh, let my people go and all that. And when God tells Moses what the plan is, it's never, these people are just being abused, and so I'm going to relieve them of that. I mean, that's an element of it. But it's they're to leave Pharaoh and go into the wilderness and sacrifice to me. Or they're to leave Egypt and go to the land that I'm going to show them. And there, of course, they're not going to live just any way they want. They're going to live as God prescribes. So I think I titled this in the syllabus, with apologies to Bob Dylan, you've got to serve somebody. And that really is the message. You're going to serve someone or some force that influences you. The choice is, the question is, which force are you going to adhere to, or are you going to submit to? Is it going to be God, or is it going to be something else? We'll talk about that more on Thursday, because one of the things, another thing that DeMille really misses that Ellen Davis talks about in your textbook is that he only covers roughly half of the book of Exodus in the film. I think she also mentions the DreamWorks Prince of Egypt. That might be another one for another generation that has shaped the view of the Exodus. It does similar things to what DeMille's classic film does in the way it misleads us. It covers about half the film, about half the book, and the rest has to do with the life God is prescribing, which is not a life to restrict the Israelites, it's to save them from themselves. And that's what the law is all about, and that's what it's about for us as well. So that's something we'll have to come to terms with. The second thing that DeMille does is presents to us a kind of historical account as he presents the Exodus story. Historical as opposed to mythic / theological, I would say. He presents the story of the Exodus as a story that could be recounted by historians. Now, let me give you kind of test to illustrate this. Who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Ramses. Ramses II. Right? Okay. And how do you know that?
He yells her, right? Isn't there a point?
In the movie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cecil B. DeMille told you it was Ramses.
Oh, okay.
The book never names the Pharaoh. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Now, I suppose for a good cinema, good piece of cinema, you couldn't tell the story without naming the Pharaoh. And maybe this is something that David Noel Friedman helped DeMille and his staff with. Who was likely the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And there are historians who will talk about this. And the name Ramses does appear in the book, but it's the name of a store city that these slaves, Hebrew slaves, are building. Nowhere is Pharaoh ever called Ramses, and the Pharaoh of Genesis either was also not named. So we don't know who the Pharaoh was that Jacob encountered, that Joseph served. We don't know who the Pharaoh is who arises at the beginning of Exodus. We don't know any of that. Given the dating of things, some have surmised that it's Ramses II. By the way, we talked about this a little bit when we did our little timeline of ancient Israel's history. The date that is kind of our anchor is 1207 BCE, which is the date of the Merneptah Stela. Merneptah was a pharaoh who, on that date, had this victory monument erected, and he's recounting victories just prior to that in the land of Canaan. You may remember also with our maps, during this period, the late Bronze Age, the Egyptians controlled what will be called the land of Canaan, later occupied by the Israelites, and will be the United Kingdom and so on. Merneptah records the victories, and Israel is one of the groups that he mentions defeated. So we can say that by that date, Israel was in control of the land to the extent that they would be recognized by an Egyptian pharaoh. But we can't say much more than that. Back up from that, when you start to kind of roughly calculate when the Exodus might have taken place. So some historians surmise Ramesses II, but the book says nothing of that. I think not identifying Pharaoh is quite important here, because as we will see, Pharaoh in Exodus is a kind of extra historical figure. I commented on this briefly last time, and we'll see it more today. When Pharaoh sees the Israelites, he feels threatened by the fact that they are multiplying, growing great in number. And it's not just that they're increasing in number. The description of what's happening is in creation language. Exodus 1:7 uses all the terms from Genesis 1 to describe the blessing of humankind. Multiply, grow in number, fill the earth. And it even uses that word for team, the word used for some of the non-human creatures. So what Pharaoh reacts against is the blessing of creation coming to pass with the Israelites in Egypt. So he is, in a sense, the anti-creator. That's the role he takes on. That's bigger than any historical figure. There have been many who've recognized this, as you may know. Martin Luther King Jr., in one of his books and in some of his speeches and sermons, would talk about Pharaoh in this kind of symbolic or emblematic way as the representative of the forces of evil and oppression. And that's exactly what the book of Exodus is doing with that. So we need to clear away some of what DeMille has done. There are lots of other details, about the story that DeMille is either reading into it or he's influenced by extra canonical stories and things like that, but these are two big ones. So let's think about the Exodus as we read it in the book of Exodus. So if by the way, I should ask something on the first test, like according to the book of Exodus, what is the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Don't choose Ramses. It'll be one of the choices, but don't choose it. It's a trick question. So let's just take this in little chunks. There are about 5 sort of sections of this first part of the story. We're going to look at roughly chapters 1 to 15 today, and then, or at least through the 18th or 20th verse of chapter 15, and then we'll pick up from there next time with the wilderness story, the giving of the law, and all that entails, which is, again, the majority of the book. The book starts with the genealogy. As Davis says, this is important to note. Who are these people we're going to be learning about? They are the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Now, just a note about translations. The expression here is in Hebrew, B'nai Israel. And that expression appears all over the Old Testament, especially all over the Pentateuch. And it can have 2 meanings. And the NRSV tries to sort this out. The NIV translates it at every point, sons of Israel. That's sort of woodenly what it says. The translators of the NRSV recognized, however, that it doesn't always mean the same thing. Sometimes it means all the Israelites, men, women, children, everybody. And so when it does mean that, they translate Israelites. But at the beginning of Exodus, it has a more literal meaning. It's referring to those 12 male children of Jacob. And they are the ones who are being named here. They are listed, and you see the list of them, beginning with the oldest, going to the youngest, beginning with Reuben, and going down to Joseph. Joseph already being in Egypt. So that's why the literal translation here is literally the sons of the person Jacob. Then, verse 6, Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. Verse 7, the key verse that we looked at last time. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Again, this is the language of creation. It's the language God used to bless humankind in the beginning. And it seems the point now is that the Israelites are beginning to realize these blessings. God is, as God intended when starting with Abraham and Sarah, beginning to bless all humankind through these people. It's working. The complication arises then in verse 8. A new Pharaoh arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, the word to know, as you may have commonly heard, often speaks of a more intimate knowledge. It's not just an intellectual awareness or something like that. Or it has to do with a deeper kind of association. It certainly seems to fit here because we're going to see later Pharaoh use this same language to say something a bit more explicit. That is really the key to Pharaoh's problem. Over in chapter 5, when Moses encounters him, and Moses says, you know, the Lord has sent me to say, let my people go. Israel is my firstborn son. Let him go, then they go and make a sacrifice in the wilderness. Pharaoh responds by saying, who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. This is just one, this is kind of the summary statement of the whole plot. Pharaoh does not know the Lord, does not know Joseph, through whom the Lord has been working, and so begins to act against the people of Joseph, and then refuses, when confronted with it, to change it. And he is in essence taking a stance against God, against God's intentions, and against the creation as a whole. There's a lot going on here in the story, more than just a people who were oppressed by an evil ruler and enslaved. That's part of the story that we shouldn't discount, but it's the larger purposes of God in the world and Pharaoh trying to thwart them. Well, the story begins to move toward a solution to this problem when we read in chapter 2 about the birth of a boy to the house of Levi. This is the story of the birth of Moses. Now, you're going to encounter a nice chapter and treatment on this in the Berman book. It's the final main chapter of the book. And so I won't touch on that too much now, but I hope you will find that interesting. It's interesting in two ways, I think, because Berman first compares this story to another well-known story of the birth of a ruler, Sargon of Akkad. And these are often compared, but he brings up the comparison to talk about this larger idea that the Old Testament and the Torah are presenting a really democratized idea of authority, rulership, and things like that. So he does a really fine job of laying that out. He also presents a kind of history of interpretation and shows some wonderful examples of artwork that reflect on this. That especially when you're used to what happened, in the story, as Cecil B. DeMille tells it, interesting to see how the classical artists have depicted it. Things they pick up on that DeMille doesn't notice or worry about, but really fascinating, I think. So enjoy that chapter. It may surprise you when you get to it that this is part of Berman's argument, but it's really a really nice final chapter in the book that you're reading. So Moses is born to these two Hebrews from the tribe of Levi. They put him in the basket because Pharaoh is trying to kill all of the Hebrew babies. This is his mother's attempt to preserve him. And so Pharaoh's daughter finds him, has compassion. You know how this story goes. His sister is watching and just happens to pop up and would you like for me to go get a Hebrew woman to nurse him? And she goes and gets the child's own mother, who nurses him, and brings him to Pharaoh's daughter when he is weaned, and he becomes like her child. He's adopted. There's no sense, though, in the story that Moses ever is unaware of who he is and what his lineage is. In the film, this is this great secret that the character who's not part of the story of Exodus holds, and she holds this blanket. She's like, it's like extortion. She's holding this so that if she ever needs to get something over on Pharaoh's daughter, she can. And all that's great, movie and all that. Interesting part of the story that she has this sensibility, and yet nobody notices it. Again, it's related to the Sargon story. It's a motif that we see of the birth and preservation of a ruler who's going to come in the future, and their life is threatened early on, but they're preserved. That's part of the mythic character of it. But we do have to wonder, what's Pharaoh's daughter, according to the person writing the story, what's about this? And the main thing is that she has compassion. And, so some of the artwork does interesting things with that. Seen that yet. Moses identifies with his own people for the murder because he has compassion on one of the Hebrew slaves being beaten by an Egyptian. And so he flees away to Midian in the wilderness. And this is something that you may recognize now as a pattern in these narratives. A man goes to well, man meets woman at well, not man finds wife in the woman he meets at the well. This happened with Rebecca. It was Rebecca and Isaac. I mean, it was the family representative who does it, but he finds the wife for Isaac at the well. Jacob meets Rebecca, meets Rachel at the well. So it's not a surprise when Moses shows up at a well in Midian and meets the daughters of Jethro or Ruel and finds among them a wife. This also sets up, the story in John 4, Jesus with the woman at the well. Everyone who knows these stories, the first time they hear this, they think, oh, Jesus is about to meet a wife here. And of course, that's not what happens. Something very different goes on. And it's and that's part of the irony of that story in John's gospel. But this is something that is a motif. Moses then, of course, makes a life there in Midian. The next couple of chapters then present the call of or commissioning of Moses. And this, according to the classical source theories, this seems to be the Elokis source, if there is an E source. Moses is at Horeb, that's the name of the mountain, and his father-in-law is named Jethro, and those are the two bits of vocabulary that the E source uses that many, at least in the classical division of sources, use to distinguish E from J. But most importantly here, we have a story of Moses' call that follows a pattern of such stories in the Old Testament and really in the Bible in general. And the stories go something like this, where they have these elements. There's an appearance of God or an angel to a person. The person responds with fear. I guess that shouldn't be a surprise. How else would you respond if an angel appeared to you, or if God spoke to you? I heard the biblical scholar James Sanders once talk about this, the form of these stories, and he got to the second element, and he said, if God shows up and talks to you directly, you don't kick your feet up on the coffee table and say, what can I do for you? Fear is a natural reaction. Then there is assurance, don't be afraid, or something, the commissioning itself, and then often signs of the future success. And that's exactly what we have in this story. We can recognize many, many other stories that follow this pattern, and we'll see some examples in Judges and after that, and you see them in the prophetic book. What's distinctive here, first, just a note, as this begins, chapter 3, verses 7 to 12 gives us kind of an encapsulated version of the purpose of this call. The Lord said, I've observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their suffering. And I've come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them out to that land, to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the land, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I've also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Then Moses begins his objections. What's distinctive about this story is how many objections Moses gives. And there are a bunch of them. And the bulk of the story is taken up with these objections. The first one is Moses says to God's commissioning, God identifies God's self as the God of the ancestors. And so Moses says, what is your name? When I come to the Israelites and they ask, who is this God of our ancestors? What is his name? A big puzzle here is why Moses asked this question. And it's one we don't have an answer to, but there are several possibilities. I mean, one is that maybe Moses is just curious, just wants to know. Maybe, secondly, he wants to know for just the reason that he says, when I come to the Israelites, I want to give them some information. To something that will let them know for sure I've been talking with you. Well, the third possibility is that Moses here wants to manipulate the deity. This is a common thing in the ancient world, a human being encountering a divine being, whether a force of good or evil, that the idea that if you could know the name, you had some power over it. And just the opposite, if the evil spirit or good spirit knew the person's name, they were thought to have some authority over it. They would have an advantage. This is behind, by the way, some of those exorcism stories in the Gospels where Jesus doesn't ask the name of the evil spirit, but they immediately know his. He hasn't disguised himself, and they call out to him and call him by name, and still Jesus is able to just send them away without any battle at all. And it's kind of testimony to his power as an exorcist. And no one else could do it. God's answer then is quite interesting because God doesn't really give him an answer. It's not immediately. The answer he gives, though, is quite important. In chapter 3, verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. What he says in Hebrew reads, Hayeh, Asher, Hayeh. This middle word being a relative particle, who or what or that. Two verbs that are identical. And they can mean, just as the translation here reads, I am who I am, or as the note in the new RSV says, and the NIV may do the same, I will be who I will be. What on earth does that mean? Is God giving Moses an answer? Is God avoiding giving Moses an answer? It's just not quite clear just from this verse. But a couple of things here. He's using a form of the verb to be in Hebrew, hayah. And verse 15, which many scholars think was added later, whether or not that's true or not, in its present form, we do encounter God's name. And so in present form, this verse 14 seems to explain something about God's name, or maybe it's the evasion and then we get the name. But in 15, the name comes, it's translated, the Lord. The name probably read originally Yahweh. So a couple of things about this. Why do we translate the Lord in small caps rather than just translate it Yahweh? It's because, first of all, Hebrew was written in consonants, as you probably know, and the consonants here are these. Now, probably originally it was read because people had to supply vowels, even though they weren't written. It probably was written and pronounced Yahweh, which is a causative form of the verb to be that I wrote up here. And so the name meant something like the one who is, or the one who causes to be, rather, which is a way of saying that this one being described is the creator, the one who is responsible for all things, the one who causes to be. But over time, this name came to be sacred and ceased to be spoken. And the scribes who eventually put in the vowel points for us, and the primary source for this is the manuscript in about 1000, we talked about it before, the Leningrad Codex. When they write in the vowels, they write in the vowels for another word. So instead of writing Yahweh, they put in vowels for the word Adonai, which is the common word meaning Lord, small l. It's a word people would have used for the king or some superior of any kind. And so the scribe signaled that when you come to the divine name, you don't pronounce that name, you read this other word, Adonai. So for that reason, our translations read the Lord with small caps. The name is not, you just read this literally, which is, by the way, if you're looking at the Hebrew, you really can't read it because it doesn't have enough vowels in it to read the whole thing. But if you tried to do that, you would read, this is a half vowel actually, not an A here, with the Y pronounced as a J, as the Germans would do, and the W pronounced as a V sound, as it sometimes is, Jehovah. Some of the old translations, will have Jehovah in it. And Jehovah's Witnesses make a big deal out of, this is God's name, this is the only name you can use. That's really a misunderstanding of what's going on with this name. It's the vowels are signaling for us to read and pronounce another word. In other words, when we encounter this, you've got consonants from one word, vowels from another word. So the scribes are telling you, pronounce Adonai, but know that that's not what's written in the text. Really interesting thing they do theologically and scribally. So our translators trying to figure out how do you deal with that, how do you follow the cues of the scribes? It's impossible to do it literally. So they've come up with this solution, which is pretty good, I think. Use the word Lord, but in a different form. So the Lord, small caps. Still debates about the exact meaning, the implications of the name. It was a sentence name. And exactly how that would have been understood. And we sort of think we know that, but that's not the job of translators to do that. They're trying to give us, a rendering of what's there, and that's a pretty good one to come up with. Write this word Lord in different characters, small caps. So when you see the Lord, know that that's what's going on. By the way, you will sometimes see God addressed in our translations as Lord written this way, capital L, and then smaller case letters. In that case, the word in Hebrew is Adonai. That word is the common word for Lord, is sometimes used of God, just straight away. But when it's used that way, it's not the name of God. It's this title for God, way of speaking to God. So anyway, that's what's going on. It's a really confusing passage, and one of the most difficult passages in the Old Testament, most would say. You know exactly what's being intended here, but you see some of the possibilities. And we do have the divine name come up. We're going to see it referred to again in the next chapter. Well, Moses' objections, of course, go on. God continues to address Moses' objections. God gives Moses a staff that has these magical powers. He can show leprosy on demand. He can turn the Nile into blood. Looking forward to one of the plagues. And then finally gives him Aaron, his brother, as his assistant when he complains of not being able to speak well. One of the ironies of the film is that Moses speaks with such a beautiful voice. Charlton Heston plays Moses, and he's standing there not really convincingly saying, Lord, I don't know how to speak well. Chapter 4, verses 18 to 23 gives another one of these little encapsulations of what's going to happen. Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt and see whether they are still living. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. The Lord said to Moses and Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who were seeking your life are dead. And Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. And then the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. And then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I said to you, let my son go that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go. Now I will kill your firstborn son. This is the story from here to the beginning moment at the death of the firstborn that God lays before him. Right after this, on the way back to Egypt, there is this little story. I mention it only because I'm sure you've read it, and you're probably wondering, what's this all about? Verses 24 through 26. And the answer I have for you is, I have no idea, nor does anybody else. Maybe it is having to do with a kind of not ideology, but a reflection on circumcision. I mean, obviously it is that in some way or another, but who encounters Moses and why this story? It's really strange. One of those just places in the Old Testament that we have to say, we can struggle for it, but we don't really have one. When Moses gets back to Egypt, the next two chapters tell us of his confrontation with Pharaoh. Again, we've got now, notice, this is the third Pharaoh we've had referenced. We had the Pharaoh who died, and then the new Pharaoh who arose, who was trying to kill Moses, and that's the reason he fled. And now that Pharaoh has died. Another one is in place. And so, again, the film showing us, whether it's a Disney film or Cecil B. DeMille, Moses growing up with Ramses, and he goes back, and now Ramses is in control. And in the Cecil B. DeMille version, the old Pharaoh who has this soft spot for Moses, is on his deathbed. I mean, that's obviously not what this story says. But the Pharaoh, when getting the request from Moses, says, you want these people to be free? Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm just going to make it harder for them to make bricks. No straw. Make the bricks without straw. There's a part of the story then when we have in chapter 6, it's essentially the same set of events as in chapters 3 and 4, but from a different tradition. And here we have the Lord saying to Moses, in days past, I revealed myself as El Shaddai, but my name, Adonai, I did not make known. This is another revelation of the divine name in chapter 6. And remembering that old label, El Shaddai, translated God Most High, or the Lord Almighty, God Almighty, or something like that. Then in chapter 7, the plague stories begin. We're going to run through chapter 13. Plagues are presented here as signs. Signs of what? Signs of God's activity signs perhaps that the creation that Pharaoh is trying to thwart is rising up against him. Many have recognized here a parallel in the plagues, between the plagues and the acts of creation in Genesis 1. In Exodus here we have 10 plagues, slightly different number, in other accounts. In Psalm 78 and Psalm 105, there are only 8 plagues, but some have always tried to line these up with the acts of creation. Nobody's ever been able to do it exactly. You have to kind of manipulate something. But there's a rough parallel anyway between them, and that almost certainly seems to be what's intended here. So you can read through the specific plagues, beginning with the water of the Nile turning to blood, then going through frogs, gnats, flies, and so on. Some of these seem like quite annoying things, but you wonder, why are they so bad? The fly infestation, it says that the land was ruined by them. The same word here is used that's used in the flood story in Genesis 6 to 9. Talk about what's happened because of human sinfulness and violence. And so the parallels just keep cropping up between the story of creation and the plagues. Here, God is allowing the creation to rebel against Pharaoh to show the power of the Creator. One sign, I think, that this is exactly what's going on is the next to last plague, which is the plague of darkness. We might wonder, well, why is that so bad? And part of our lack of understanding is because we have artificial light, and darkness is not such an issue for us. But darkness is the first act of creation. Interestingly, when Psalm 105 lists the plagues, it lists darkness first. And the different order may just be a different tradition, but it's certainly highlighting the order of things in creation. That the first act of creation was God separating light from darkness. So this is the reversion back to that pre-creation state before the final blow comes to try to convince Pharaoh that he should let the people go. The plagues stand in parallel to God's acts in creation. The final plague then, the death of the firstborn, is essentially God saying life itself isn't going to work anymore for the Egyptians. All of this just happens where the Egyptians live. None of it applies to where the Hebrews live. Interesting to read the difference in the darkness. Darkness comes over the Egyptians, but not over the Israelites. And all the things that go with darkness doesn't apply. Davis addresses this a bit. First of all, there are different expressions of this, and 3 different ways the same verb is used, or set of verbs. Sometimes it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Sometimes it says simply Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He hardened it, no subject there. And then sometimes it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's a mix of verbs. I think Davis is exactly right when she says that from the very start, we can see Pharaoh opposing what God is doing. And we see that after 1:7, the Israelites are fulfilling the blessing of God in creation. And in response to that, Pharaoh acts against the creation itself. In that act, he's showing himself to be the opponent of God, the enemy of creation. So he's already doing this. And so the rest is simply fulfilling that. So, yeah, I think that has been overinterpreted, as somehow Pharaoh doesn't have a chance. Well, Pharaoh's had 10 chances. And every time, when he says, yeah, I'll let people go, he changes his mind. And so that statement of God hardened Pharaoh's heart, I think is a way of saying none of this is outside God's authority. But Pharaoh does have a chance to act differently. He just doesn't, and we know that's going to be the case because of his character and how he responds. Yeah, I think those two can really go together, right? Pharaoh is claiming to be a deity, and that's not unusual for Pharaoh. He's claiming an identity the Egyptians would all recognize. To be the special agent of the Egyptian gods. And like in all cultures, this time and place, the chief god is the one who creates the world, has control over the creation. So I think that's exactly right. Yeah, it is both God's superiority over Pharaoh and over the Egyptian gods at the same time. With the final plague comes then this preparation to leave Egypt, and of course the command to observe what will be known as the Passover celebration. Chapter 12, and then continues really into chapter 13. In chapter 13, back to Eric's question about the firstborn, there's an interesting little passage about the consecration of the firstborn, where the firstborn of the Israelites, human and animal alike, are set apart as God's special possession. But the firstborn of all human beings are to be redeemed. They're not to be killed as a sacrifice to God. Something stands in their place. So here's a kind of implicit legislation against child sacrifice, recognizing that the firstborn has this special status, but the firstborn child is not to be sacrificed to God. That's verses 11 and 15. This redemption of the firstborn. So really important distinction that's already coming up in the text. That the firstborn child is this favored one who has special status. And again, the backdrop for John 3:16 of that statement. The one who is firstborn is seen as being above the rest. The description of Passover seems, it may seem obvious that this is well thought out and developed. We're not getting a blow-by-blow account of what happened in Egypt, at a particular point in time. But what that means exactly, who knows? When you start asking historical questions, they're really impossible to answer. Julius Wellhausen famously said that the Exodus is not the setting for Passover. Passover is the setting for the Exodus. Now, that seems to me to go too far. Wellhausen was kind of the father of a historical method that was very skeptical of the historicity of anything. The American tradition has been different. I mentioned W.F. Albright earlier, and he was one who had much more confidence in the historicity of these events, that, at least in that there was some event that happened, there was an Exodus, and the memory of the Exodus produced the Passover. It's always seemed to me that to be kind of the logical way it would happen. Why would you develop a ceremony and then invent an event, to go with it? But differences in approaching the history of Israel. But Wellhausen had one. He has his students who follow in his line, and Albright had his students. The best representative of the Albright school was probably John Bright. His classic work on the history of ancient Israel. Westminster John Knox Press publishes now in a it's in like a third edition, and they decided not to update it anymore, just to publish it like as a classic work. And it's one, if you want a work that takes that approach, that's one worth buying. Don't rush out and buy it, though. Your husband, be safe. I've said it, okay? You don't have to spend money on this, but someday you can pick up a used copy, though, of Wright's History for, $10 or $15. That's probably the way to go. Chapters 14 and 15, then, the Israelites escape, and we have the account of the crossing of the sea itself. We have two accounts that you recognize, the narrative account in chapter 14 and the poetic account in 15, 1 through 18. The poetic account almost certainly is the oldest, and it's recognized as one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the Old Testament. And the narrative then is based on that in some sense or another. We have at least one other example of this in Judges 4 and 5. We have a piece of poetry that's very old, a narrative that then goes with it, that reads things sort of literally. The differences are kind of interesting. I want to say more about the poem itself in a moment, but in chapter 14, one of the distinctive things actually is that Moses is the agent of God. He speaks to the people. God speaks to Moses, and the actions of God are mediated through Moses. Verses 13 to 14 kind of sum up what's happening here in the story. When Moses says, "The Lord will fight for you." That's the gist of it. This is not, they don't have a strategy. They're wandering around in the wilderness, and some have always tried to explain, the escape as a natural event. I can see why people do that. Some explain it as this wasn't the Red Sea. It was a sea of reeds, which was a shallow body of water, and it's blown back. And then there was even at one point a statement that a wind blew the water back overnight. Some have tried to explain it as a naturally occurring event, but that sort of misses the main point of the narrative, which is this statement: "The Lord will fight for you. You just stand back and watch." By the way, that verse is sort of famously used by a couple of Mennonite scholars. One, John Howard Yoder, who's become quite controversial because of his personal behavior. But his book, The Politics of Jesus, where he argues for nonviolence, interestingly, from the Old Testament, he highlights this verse as the one who does it. But someone who's not that controversial, Miller Durand, was an Old Testament scholar, taught the same school as Yoder before Yoder left and went to Notre Dame. Lind made similar arguments that what these texts are about are Yahweh fighting for Israel. Israel doesn't have a military strategy or military power. The Lord fights for them, and that's the lesson they've learned from history, and it's the overarching message of the Old Testament. So it's interesting that Mennonites could make an argument for pacifism from these Old Testament texts, but this is how they've done it, and some still do. When you read through chapter 14, it may be obvious to you if you read real closely. You'll see it that there are some different sources involved here. How did the Egyptians die? What was the cause of their death? There seem to be multiple explanations here. So, for example, verse 26, the water comes back on the Egyptians, and that's concluded in verse 28. This seems to be, of course, what DeMille wants to show in his film. You know what they did? Apparently, they took 2 bowls of Jell-O before they were gel, just mixed up, and they poured them together into some container, and filming that, that's where you get the scene of the waters coming back, onto the sea and crushing the Egyptians. That was high tech back in those days. 2 bowls of Jello poured together. But at one point, the text seems to say that 2 walls of water on the one side, when the Israelites pass through on dry ground, the water then comes back on the Egyptians. But then verse 27 speaks of the water returning to its normal depth at dawn, as though gradually. And that comes from the idea that the wind has blown the water back. And then verse 27b says the Lord threw the Egyptians into the water. Well, earlier there's talk of the Lord clogging their wheels so they can't get out. Multiple explanations, it seems, that are kind of folded together here. Well, just a couple of notes about the poetry in chapter 15. This beautiful, beautiful poem, the Song of the Sea, it's sometimes called. Verse 3 introduces and gives an identity of God. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. That's quite a controversial statement for some people, but it's speaking of what God's doing here to the Egyptians, against the Egyptians. And more time than we've got here to talk about what that means, that God is a warrior. But remember, this is about God fighting the anti-creator, fighting not really a historical foe, but one who's trying to undo the very creation itself. Note that in chapter 15, Moses is completely absent. Moses is not in the poem at all. It's God's action alone. No human mediator. No human does anything. Everything is divine action. So look, verses 4 and 5, 8 and 10. You see all the things it says God does. Verse 12, the earth swallowed them. The earth itself and all the elements are rising up against Pharaoh. They're all at the disposal of the Creator. But most importantly, as the poem focuses in some ways on the destruction of the Egyptians, but verse 13 introduces God's steadfast love. That's what this is all a sign of. God is faithful to the people of Israel. The word here is a very important word in the Old Testament. Chesed. The first letter being a hard H sound in Hebrew. It's a word that connotes God's faithfulness to God's people in covenant. And so, by your steadfast love, you guided them to your holy abode, anticipating the trek to the land of promise, anticipating Sinai, and another very important theological word that in this God redeems Israel. Which redemption is this very important concept that comes out of debt slavery, really. One who has to sell himself or herself into debt slavery can be bought out by a relative who has means and freed in that sense. And so that's the role God has in relation to Israel, redeems them. And then the poem ends with language of kingship. The Lord will reign forever. And the verb there can be translated, will be king forever. Verses 20 and 21 then seem to present a second presentation of the song. this time by Miriam and the women. We don't know, and we'll say more about this when we get to Chronicles, we don't know if women had a role in the music of the temple. Some reasons to think they did not, but they certainly had a role in victory celebrations. We see that a number of times. We see it in the story of David, we see it in Judges. And so Miriam and the women lead the song that is the victory celebration to conclude here. Well, again, this is less than half the book. It's the focus of the film, and for reasons we can understand, I think it makes for good cinema. But in some ways, the most important part is going to come next. The purpose for which God has led these people out of Egypt and led them through the wilderness. And so we'll take that up next time.